In the dusty archives of the Chicago Historical Society, researchers occasionally stumble upon photographs that tell stories far darker than their innocent appearance suggests. One such image, discovered in 2019 among a collection of early 20th century family portraits, shows what appears to be a typical middle-class American family from 1907. The sepia-toned photograph captures 5 people arranged in the formal style of the era. Parents, flanked by 3 children, all dressed in their finest clothing for what was clearly a special occasion. The father, William Morrison, stands tall and dignified in a dark suit, his hand resting protectively on his wife's shoulder. Catherine Morrison sits gracefully beside him, wearing an elaborate white dress with intricate lacework that speaks to the family's comfortable financial status. Their eldest daughter, Margaret, age 16, displays the serious expression expected of a young woman on the verge of adulthood. The youngest child, 8-year-old Sarah, clutches a small doll and stares solemnly at the camera. But it is the middle child who draws immediate attention and creates an unsettling feeling in anyone who examines the photograph closely. 12-year-old Thomas Morrison stands between his sisters, and unlike every other family member who maintains the stoic composure typical of formal portraits from that era, Thomas is smiling. His grin is wide and unmistakable, stretching across his face in a way that seems almost inappropriate for the formal nature of the occasion. At first glance, Thomas's smile might appear charming, perhaps the expression of a happy child unable to contain his joy during a special family moment. However, there is something deeply unsettling about the quality of that smile. It doesn't reach his eyes, which remain cold and distant. The expression seems forced, almost manic, as if he's struggling to maintain a facade while something far different lurks beneath the surface. The photograph was taken at Brennan's Photography Studio in downtown Chicago on September 15th, 1907. What makes this portrait particularly significant is that it would be the last photograph ever taken of the Morrison family together. Within 6 months, a tragedy would befall the household that would shock the local community and leave investigators with questions that remain unanswered more than a century later. The Morrison family had been part of Chicago's growing middle class since William. Morrison arrived from Ireland in 1885. Unlike many immigrants who struggled to establish themselves in America's rapidly industrializing cities, William quickly found success as a supervisor at one of the city's major steel foundries. His steady income and careful financial planning allowed the family to purchase a comfortable 2-story house in the Bridgeport neighborhood, an area known for its hardworking immigrant families and strong community bonds. Catherine Morrison, née O'Sullivan, had met William shortly after his arrival in Chicago. She was the daughter of Irish immigrants who had established themselves as shop owners, and her education and refinement made her an ideal partner for William's ambitions of social advancement. Their marriage in 1890 was viewed by both families as an excellent match that combined love with practical considerations of financial stability and social standing. The Morrison household was known throughout the neighborhood for its respectability and religious devotion. The family attended St. Bridget's Catholic Church every Sunday without fail, and Catherine was active in various church committees and charitable organizations. William's reputation as a reliable worker and honest man made him a respected figure in the community, and neighbors often sought his advice on matters ranging from employment opportunities to family disputes. Their 3 children were raised with strict discipline and high expectations. Margaret, the eldest, was known for her academic achievements and planned to attend teachers' college after finishing her secondary education. Sarah, the youngest, was described by family friends as a sweet and obedient child who showed promise in music and art. Thomas, however, had always been different from his siblings. Teachers at the local Catholic school reported that while he was intelligent and capable of excellent work, his behavior was often unpredictable. He could be charming and helpful one day, then sullen and defiant the next. Some neighbors whispered that Thomas had inherited what they called the Irish temper, but those closest to the family suspected that his problems ran deeper than simple childhood misbehavior. Despite these concerns about Thomas's temperament, the Morrison family maintained their reputation as one of Bridgeport's most stable and respectable households. The decision to have a formal family portrait taken in September 1907 was intended to commemorate William's recent promotion at the foundry and to create a lasting record of the family's success in America. In the months leading up to the family portrait session, several incidents occurred that, in retrospect, should have served as clear warnings of the tragedy to come. However, the Morrison family's commitment to maintaining their respectable image prevented them from addressing these problems openly, and the tight-knit nature of their Catholic community discouraged outside interference in family matters. The first significant incident happened in June 1907, when Mrs. Catherine Murphy, a neighbor, reported that she had seen Thomas Morrison torturing a stray cat in the alley behind the family's house. When she confronted him, Thomas had looked at her with what she later described as empty eyes, and had calmly walked away without saying a word. Mrs. Murphy debated whether to tell Catherine Morrison about the incident, but ultimately decided against it, not wanting to cause trouble between neighbors. Around the same time, Sister Mary Catherine, Thomas's teacher at St. Bridget's School, began to notice disturbing changes in his classroom behavior. While Thomas had always been a challenging student, his conduct became increasingly erratic during the spring of 1907. He would sometimes sit motionless for entire class periods, staring at nothing, then suddenly burst into inappropriate laughter or make comments that had no connection to the lesson being taught. More troubling were the drawings that Sister Mary Catherine discovered in Thomas's school notebooks. While other children drew typical scenes of houses, trees, and family members, Thomas's artwork depicted violent scenes that were completely inappropriate for a 12-year-old child. When questioned about these drawings, Thomas would simply smile, the same unsettling smile that would later be captured in the family portrait, and refuse to explain their meaning. At home, Margaret and Sarah Morrison had begun to exhibit signs of fear around their brother. Margaret confided to her best friend that Thomas had been acting strange and that she was afraid to be alone in the house with him. Sarah had started having nightmares and would often crawl into her parents' bed in the middle of the night, claiming that Thomas was watching her while she slept. William and Catherine Morrison were aware that something was wrong with their son, but they struggled to understand the nature of his problems. In 1907, there was little understanding of childhood mental health issues, and families typically dealt with behavioral problems privately rather than seeking outside help. The stigma associated with mental illness in the Catholic community made it even more difficult for the Morrisons to acknowledge the severity of Thomas's condition. On September 15, 1907, the Morrison family arrived at Brennan's photography studio for their formal portrait session. James Brennan, the studio owner, had been photographing Chicago families for over 15 years and was known for his ability to capture the dignity and respectability that his clients desired in their formal portraits. Brennan later told investigators that he immediately noticed something unusual about the Morrison family dynamics during the session. While William, Catherine, Margaret, and Sarah all cooperated normally with his directions for positioning and posture, Thomas seemed to be fighting some internal struggle throughout the entire process. The boy kept making faces when he thought no one was looking, Brennan recalled. I had to take several practice shots because he would grimace or stick out his tongue just as I was about to expose the plate. His parents seemed embarrassed and kept apologizing for his behavior. What made this session particularly memorable for Brennan was Thomas's sudden transformation when the final photograph was taken. After nearly an hour of disruptive behavior, Thomas suddenly became completely still and compliant. However, instead of adopting the serious expression that was expected for formal portraits of that era, he broke into the wide, unsettling smile that would become the photograph's most disturbing feature. Brennan remembered being struck by the contrast between Thomas's smile and his eyes. Most children, when they smile for a photograph, you can see the happiness in their whole face, he explained. But this boy's eyes remained completely cold, even while he was grinning. It was the most unnatural expression I had ever seen in my 20 years of photography. Catherine Morrison attempted to correct her son's inappropriate expression, but Thomas refused to change his demeanor. William Morrison, clearly frustrated by his son's behavior, finally decided that they would proceed with the photograph as it was, rather than continue to struggle with Thomas's defiance. The resulting image captured not just the Morrison family's formal poses, but also the underlying tension that had been building within the household for months. While 4 family members display the expected dignified expressions of the era, Thomas's smile serves as a disturbing reminder that something sinister was lurking beneath the surface of this apparently respectable family. Brennan completed the session and promised to have the finished portraits ready within a week, but he later admitted that the experience left him feeling unsettled for days afterward. Following the photography session, the Morrison family returned to their routine, but the underlying tensions that had been captured in that disturbing portrait continued to escalate. William Morrison threw himself into his work at the foundry, perhaps using his demanding job as an escape from the increasingly uncomfortable atmosphere at home. Catherine Morrison maintained her involvement in church activities and charitable work, but neighbors began to notice that she seemed more withdrawn and anxious than usual. Margaret Morrison, now in her final year of secondary school, spent increasing amounts of time at the homes of friends and classmates. Several of her companions later recalled that Margaret had seemed reluctant to return home in the evenings and had made vague comments about problems at home, though she never provided specific details about what was troubling her. 8-year-old Sarah Morrison's behavior became increasingly clingy and fearful. Her teacher, Miss Elizabeth O'Brien, noticed that Sarah had difficulty concentrating in class and would often ask to visit the school nurse, complaining of stomach aches and headaches that appeared to have no physical cause. Sarah's artwork and writing assignments, which had previously shown typical childhood themes of family and home, began to reflect anxiety and fear. Thomas Morrison's behavior during this period became even more erratic and unpredictable. Father Michael O'Malley, the priest at St. Bridget's Church, later reported that Thomas had stopped attending Sunday services regularly, and when he did appear, his conduct was disruptive and inappropriate. During one particularly memorable incident, Thomas had begun laughing loudly during the consecration, forcing his parents to remove him from the church in embarrassment. At school, Sister Mary Catherine documented several incidents where Thomas had been caught stealing small items from other students' desks. When confronted about these thefts, Thomas would deny any wrongdoing while displaying the same unsettling smile that had been captured in the family portrait. His academic performance, which had never been exceptional, began to deteriorate markedly as he seemed to lose all interest in his studies. The neighborhood children had begun to avoid Thomas entirely. Parents instructed their sons and daughters not to play with him, though most children seemed to instinctively sense that something was wrong and stayed away without needing parental guidance. This social isolation only seemed to increase Thomas's anger and resentment toward his family and community. During the winter months of 1907 and early 1908, several neighbors reported hearing loud arguments coming from the Morrison house, usually late at night when the voices would carry clearly through the cold air. On March 12, 1908, the Morrison family's hidden crisis finally exploded into a tragedy that would shock the Bridgeport neighborhood and make headlines in Chicago newspapers for weeks. The events of that night began like many others in the Morrison household, with the family gathering for their evening meal in an atmosphere of barely controlled tension. According to the subsequent police investigation, the family had eaten dinner together around 6 p.m., with conversation limited to basic necessities. Margaret had homework to complete, Sarah was playing quietly with her dolls, and William was reading the evening newspaper while Catherine cleaned up from the meal. Thomas had been unusually quiet during dinner, which his parents later admitted had actually been a relief after weeks of disruptive behavior. Around 8:30 p.m., neighbors reported hearing raised voices coming from the Morrison house. Mrs. Catherine Murphy, who lived next door, later testified that she had heard what sounded like William Morrison shouting at someone, followed by the sound of furniture being moved or knocked over. However, domestic arguments were not uncommon in the neighborhood, and Mrs. Murphy decided not to interfere in what she assumed was a private family matter. The shouting continued intermittently for nearly an hour, with several neighbors reporting that they had heard Catherine Morrison crying and pleading with someone. At approximately 9:45 p.m., the Morrison house fell silent, and the neighbors assumed that whatever dispute had been occurring had finally been resolved. It wasn't until the following morning that the true scope of the tragedy became apparent. When Margaret Morrison failed to appear for school and Sarah was absent from her classes, Sister Mary Catherine became concerned. The Morrison children had never missed school without prior notification, and their absence was completely out of character for the religiously devout family. Sister Mary Catherine walked to the Morrison house during her lunch break and found the front door unlocked, which was highly unusual for the security-conscious family. When her knocks went unanswered, she entered the house to check on the family's welfare. What she discovered inside the Morrison house would haunt her for the rest of her life. The scene that greeted her was beyond anything that the gentle nun could have imagined, and her screams brought neighbors running to see what had caused such distress, the tragedy that had befallen. The Morrison family was so shocking that it would become one of Chicago's most notorious unsolved cases, with implications that reached far beyond the boundaries of the Bridgeport neighborhood. Sister Mary Catherine's screams from inside the Morrison house brought several neighbors running, including Mrs. Catherine Murphy and Mr. Patrick O'Brien, a local shopkeeper who had known the family for years. What they found when they entered the house was a scene of violence so shocking that it would be discussed in whispered conversations throughout Chicago for decades to come. In the front parlor, William Morrison's body was discovered near his favorite reading chair. The evidence suggested that he had been attacked while sitting peacefully, perhaps reading his evening newspaper. The severity of his injuries indicated that the assault had been sudden and vicious, giving him no opportunity to defend himself or escape. Catherine Morrison was found in the kitchen, where she had apparently been cornered while trying to flee from her attacker. The scattered dishes and overturned chairs suggested that she had fought desperately for her life, but had ultimately been overwhelmed by the violence directed against her. The most heartbreaking discovery was made upstairs in the children's bedrooms. 8-year-old Sarah Morrison was found in her bed, still clutching the small doll that she had held during the family's portrait session 6 months earlier. The positioning of her body suggested that she'd been sleeping when the attack occurred, never knowing what was happening to her family downstairs. 16-year-old Margaret Morrison was discovered in the hallway between her bedroom and the stairs, indicating that she had attempted to flee when she heard the violence beginning below. The evidence suggested that she had hidden in her room initially, but had tried to escape when she realized the severity of the situation. The Chicago Police Department arrived within minutes of being summoned, and Detective Inspector James McCarthy immediately recognized that this was unlike any crime he had encountered in his 15 years of police work. The level of violence was extreme, even by Chicago's standards. And the fact that an entire family had been eliminated suggested either a carefully planned crime or an explosion of uncontrolled rage. Most significantly, 12-year-old Thomas Morrison was nowhere to be found. His bedroom showed signs of hasty packing, with some clothing and personal items missing. The window in Thomas's room was found open, despite the cold March weather, suggesting that he had used it as an escape route. A citywide search was immediately launched for Thomas Morrison, who was initially considered a potential victim who might have escaped the carnage. However, as investigators began to piece together the evidence from the crime scene, a more disturbing possibility began to emerge. The discovery of the Morrison family tragedy sent shockwaves through Chicago, particularly because it challenged fundamental assumptions about family safety and childhood innocence that were central to early 20th century American society. Detective Inspector James McCarthy had investigated hundreds of crimes during his career with the Chicago Police Department, but the Morrison case presented him with evidence that challenged everything he thought he knew about criminal behavior. As his team methodically examined the crime scene, a pattern began to emerge that pointed toward a conclusion that was almost too disturbing to accept. The first crucial piece of evidence was the lack of any signs of forced entry into the Morrison house. All windows were secured from the inside, and the front and back doors showed no evidence of being tampered with. This suggested that the perpetrator had either possessed a key to the house or had been admitted willingly by a family member. More significantly, the pattern of violence showed an intimate knowledge of the family's routines and vulnerabilities. William Morrison had been attacked while engaged in his typical evening activity of reading the newspaper. Catherine had been cornered in the kitchen, where she spent most of her time during evening hours. Sarah had been attacked in her sleep, suggesting that the perpetrator knew exactly when and where to find her most defenseless. The weapon used in the attacks was never found, despite extensive searches of the house and surrounding neighborhood. However, the nature of the injuries suggested that it had been a common household tool, possibly a kitchen knife or similar implement that would have been readily available within the Morrison home. Dr. Harrison Wells, the coroner who examined the bodies, provided testimony that further supported the theory that the crimes had been committed by someone familiar with the family. The positioning of the victims and the specific nature of their injuries suggested that the attacker had known exactly how to approach each family member to minimize their ability to resist or call for help. Perhaps most disturbing of all was the discovery of a note hidden in Thomas Morrison's bedroom. Written in his distinctive handwriting, the note read, "They never understood me. They never tried to help me. Now they will never hurt me again." This message, combined with Thomas's mysterious disappearance, transformed him from a potential victim into the primary suspect in his family's destruction. Detective McCarthy interviewed dozens of neighbors, teachers, and family friends, all of whom confirmed that Thomas Morrison had exhibited increasingly disturbing behavior in the months leading up to the tragedy. The photograph taken at Brennan's studio in September 1907 suddenly took on new significance as potential evidence of Thomas's deteriorating mental state. The investigation also revealed that several warning signs had been ignored or dismissed by adults who might have been able to intervene before the situation reached its tragic conclusion. The manhunt for 12-year-old Thomas Morrison became one of the most extensive searches in Chicago's history, involving not only local police, but also federal authorities and law enforcement agencies throughout the Midwest. The fact that the suspect was a child made the case unprecedented, as few people could accept that someone so young could be capable of such extreme violence. Detective Inspector McCarthy coordinated search efforts that extended from Chicago to the Canadian border, following reports of sightings that came in from dozens of communities. Railroad stations, port facilities, and major roadways were monitored in the hope of tracking Thomas's movements. His photograph, ironically the disturbing family portrait from Brennan's studio, was distributed to law enforcement agencies and published in newspapers throughout the region. Several credible sightings were reported in the weeks following the tragedy. A railroad conductor reported seeing a boy matching Thomas's description boarding a freight train heading west toward Iowa. A shopkeeper in Milwaukee reported selling food to a young boy who had paid with coins and seemed nervous and desperate. A farmer in Wisconsin reported finding evidence that someone had been sleeping in his barn and had stolen clothing from his laundry line. However, none of these leads resulted in Thomas's capture, and as weeks turned to months, the search began to lose momentum. The possibility that Thomas had died during his flight, either from exposure, accident, or other misfortune, became increasingly likely. Though his body was never found, Dr. Emanuel Hoffman, one of Chicago's few specialists in mental health disorders, was consulted by police to help understand Thomas's psychological state and predict his possible behavior. Dr. Hoffman's assessment, based on interviews with teachers and neighbors, suggested that Thomas was suffering from what he termed moral insanity, a condition that made him incapable of understanding the difference between right and wrong. This boy exhibited all the classic signs of what we are beginning to understand as psychopathic behavior, Dr. Hoffman explained to investigators. His inability to form normal emotional connections, combined with his escalating violence toward animals and his lack of remorse for his actions, created a perfect storm for this type of tragic outcome. The search for Thomas Morrison continued officially for over a year, but gradually the active investigation was scaled back as other cases demanded attention. However, Detective Inspector McCarthy never formally closed the case, and reports of possible sightings continued to trickle in for several more years. The disappearance of Thomas Morrison became part of Chicago folklore, with parents using his story to warn their children about the importance of recognizing and reporting disturbing behavior in their peers. The Morrison family tragedy of 1908 left an indelible mark on Chicago's collective memory and raised questions about childhood psychology and family dynamics that were decades ahead of their time. The case became a reference point for discussions about mental health, child development, and the warning signs that adults must learn to recognize and address before they lead to irreversible consequences. Thomas Morrison was never found, despite years of reported sightings and continued investigation by both professional law enforcement and amateur detectives fascinated by the case. The most credible theory among investigators was that Thomas had died during his flight from Chicago, possibly from exposure during the harsh winter of 1908, or from an accident while traveling on freight trains. However, some researchers have suggested that Thomas may have successfully assumed a new identity and lived for many years under another name. This theory is supported by the fact that several similar cases occurred in other parts of the country during the 1910s and 1920s, instances where entire families were eliminated by a family member who then disappeared without a trace. The family portrait, taken at Brennan's photography studio, became one of the most studied photographs in criminal history. Experts in psychology and criminal behavior have analyzed Thomas's unsettling smile for over a century, using it as an example of how warning signs of dangerous behavior can be hidden in plain sight. The Morrison case also contributed to gradual changes in how American society approached childhood mental health issues. While the understanding of psychological disorders was still primitive in 1908, Thomas's story helped convince some professionals that children could indeed suffer from serious mental illness that required intervention rather than simply discipline and prayer. St. Bridget's Church, where the Morrison family had been active members, established a memorial fund in honor of William, Catherine, Margaret, and Sarah Morrison. The fund supported programs designed to help families recognize and address behavioral problems in children before they escalated to dangerous levels. The Morrison house in Bridgeport stood empty for several years after the tragedy, as no one wanted to live in a place associated with such violence. Eventually, it was demolished and replaced with a small park that serves as a quiet memorial to the family that died there. Today, more than a century later, the Morrison case continues to fascinate criminologists, psychologists, and historians who study the development of our understanding of childhood mental illness. The chilling smile in a 1907 family portrait remains a haunting reminder that evil can hide behind the most innocent faces, and that the warning signs of tragedy are often visible to those who know how to look for them. The case serves as a perpetual reminder that families, communities, and institutions must remain vigilant in protecting the vulnerable and addressing mental health issues before they spiral beyond control.